Hello, everyone. Welcome to Unmuted Love. I'm C. Eshelman, your host for today's episode, and I am delighted to share with you Shannon Schedlich. She is Dr. Shannon Schedlich, actually, the Chief Executive of Siblings Australia, where she brings leadership and advocacy experience grounded in both professional expertise and lived experience. I'm so happy to have you here, Shannon. Welcome.
Thank you. I'm very excited to be having this conversation with you.
Yeah, me too. There's more to your introduction. You have a background in community development, disability, and government, and you combine academic insight with personal understanding of the unique challenges and strengths that shape siblings and families of people with disability and chronic illness. And you are a parent of siblings, and you have an autistic stepdaughter. And I never thought to say this about myself, that I'm a parent of siblings, which I was and am. And I would always say I'm a parent of two children who are siblings. It means something different a little bit, right? The emphasis on the sibling heightens the significance of siblings in our lives, right? The importance of siblings in our lives. And if you say it the other way, it's like, that is not as important.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, I had never heard that before in my mind. I'm like, oh, that is so different. Okay, cool. So our topic today is about, you guessed it, siblings. Now, parents, I know that you have asked me a zillion times, how do I deal with the sibling stuff? And I try to tell you what I know. But here we have Shannon, who is an expert in such things. So I'm really looking forward to this conversation, and I know you will be too. So Shannon, tell me a little bit about your organization. So I think we'll just start there.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. So I've been with Siblings Australia for just over 3 years. We're an organisation that has existed for, it's our 27th year this year, and we exist to provide support for the brothers and sisters of people with disability or chronic illness. We operate in Australia, obviously, with the name Siblings Australia, but we've got resources on our website that are relevant for people regardless of their location. And what we do is we try to support siblings themselves, but also families as a whole, to make sure that sibling needs are seen and supported. We also do some systemic advocacy. So a lot of the issues that families are facing aren't individual issues. They are born from the fact that systems aren't particularly good at supporting whole families. Systems aren't particularly good at supporting people with disabilities. So then if we start looking at the layers that sit outside of that, there is that need for that systemic advocacy to talk about the impacts that supporting siblings has on the whole family. So yeah, we work across the lifespan. We've got resources from early childhood right through to end-of-life planning. And we don't consider ourselves a carer organisation. We don't see siblings through the prism of their caring responsibilities. What we really try to do is focus on how we maintain that natural relationship that sits between brothers and sisters, regardless of disability or chronic illness or any other complexities that are going on within a family.
Well, that's a lot. I think your organization is unique, and it's lovely because siblings are so impacted by chronic illness and by disability. But also, I wanted to just sort of see how you feel about this. Do you see trauma impacted children as something that's on your list of those with disabilities?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that trauma often fits into that sort of psychosocial umbrella of impacts on families. So in Australia, we talk about psychological issues as sitting under that disability umbrella. So absolutely, trauma can definitely fit within that. We also see a lot of our sibling children being impacted by trauma that exists within their homes, because there are complexities, there are medical emergencies, there are high levels of family stress. There's sometimes family violence going on with children who are unable to regulate their emotions and their outbursts, and we often see that then impacting on the sibling children as well. So in a number of ways, trauma sits within the work that we do.
Yeah, I think I was going to ask you that what do you notice siblings are carrying that most adults maybe, or parents, tend to miss or underestimate?
Oh my goodness. See, that is a long and complex and convoluted answer. I'm actually presenting at a conference next week, and I recount a story of a young woman who I spoke to not long after starting at Siblings Australia. And she talked about the recognition she had very early that her family was complex, that her parents had so much on their plates, that they were so busy, that they were so overwhelmed by what was happening within the family, that she made a conscious decision as quite a young child and without talking about it with everyone, but that she had to be easy. And kids aren't easy. Kids are wonderful and messy and, you know, they're not easy. But she internalized that message that she had to be easy because there was so much else going on within her family situation. We also see kids who act out because they don't know how else to get that attention onto them. And so, you know, they are naughty, not because they're naughty, but because they just want some of that spotlight on them. We see kids who are sort of taking bits and pieces of what they're hearing along the journey and perhaps not having the full, complete picture. And a lot of times parents are they're trying to do the right thing. They don't want to overburden their sibling child with worries about what's going on. But there's enough information coming through to the sibling child that they are able to piece together bits and pieces, and sometimes the pictures that they draw of what's happening in their family aren't necessarily correct, and it can become bigger and badder and even worse than it actually is. There are those kids who are living in families where they are experiencing that inter-sibling violence, and it's just normalised. You know, there are traumatic incidents that happen in all of our lives that we sort of look at and we go, well, that was a trauma incident. But for a lot of these families, these are happening on a day-to-day basis. Brothers and sisters are going to hospital, and is this going to be the time that they don't come home? But it's happening so often that it is sort of part of that normal family life. When we talk about adults not recognising this, it's not necessarily parents that I'm talking about. It is all of the adults that sit within the lives of these children. So it's teachers, it's people who are working in childcare situations, it's grandparents, it's aunties and uncles. You know, the number of times adult siblings reflect back to us that their grandparents or their aunties and uncles would say things to them like, don't make a fuss, you know how much mum and dad are carrying at the moment. And so they are internalising all of that. So it's all of the adults in these kids' lives who aren't necessarily picking up these things, and aren't necessarily picking up these things because kids don't feel like they have the permission to talk about how hard it is. They don't necessarily have the language to talk about how hard it is. And I think, too, we often expect more from our kids than we do for us. You know, I know some of the things that happen in our household, for example, are really hard. And my husband and I, at the end of the day, will step back and go, we need to take a deep breath. We need to do something to look after ourselves because today was a really, really tricky one. And we don't necessarily give, as small people who are living in those circumstances, the same grace. We can sort of do the thing of, oh, can you just go and look after yourselves? Can you just give me 5 minutes? Can you just give me a moment? Because today has been really hard. And so we're expecting them to have this resilience born of, I don't know where. And I come back to, you know, I'm not necessarily faulting individuals in these circumstances. I get that people are overwhelmed by the systems. They are overwhelmed by the complexity that's going on in their lives. You know, they are overwhelmed by perhaps fighting for medical outcomes or schooling outcomes or all of the different things that, as a parent of a child who has additional needs, you have to fight for, and you shouldn't have to fight for. It should just happen. But you are exhausted by having to make those arguments the whole time. And the impact that constantly fighting systems has on family units can be really detrimental to sibling children, and we need to be aware of that.
I really love this conversation, and it's a little bit frustrating, I think, because, you know, siblings are kind of carrying a mix of love and loyalty and frustration and fear and their own trauma from living in an environment that may be chaotic. And then they're really not recognized as survivors, you know, of of that very readily. So if you ask someone who's a sibling, did you have trauma in your childhood? They might say no, because they don't recognize that living in that environment was traumatic.
Absolutely.
I do know a lot of adopted parents who adopted because they had a sibling who was adopted, and they saw what their parents went through in the adoption, and they chose to adopt. And when we're talking about it for the first time, realizing that having their own children who are adopted is sort of raking up this experience that they had in childhood of, wow, okay, it was actually traumatic going through that. But they didn't really see that until they got their own children.
And I think you've picked up a really interesting point there, that nuance of emotions that goes with being a sibling. I think as adults, we get to the point where we recognize you can hold two truths. That's absolutely fine. That's part of the human experience. But if you're a child, it takes a while to develop that sense of grey in your understanding of the world. And a lot of the kids we talk to will talk about the fact that, once you get to them to the point where they do feel like they can open up and they do feel like they can be honest, they will say things to you like, I'm actually really embarrassed by the fact that people look at us when we go out, when we go to the shops. But then, how horrible am I? Am I a bad brother or sister because I feel embarrassed about my sibling's disability? Or, I feel angry at them because we went out and they had a meltdown because they were dysregulated and it was an unfamiliar environment. And I know they can't help it. And what does that say about me, that I felt anger towards them when they can't help it? And there are these so many different layers of emotion that we don't talk to kids about the ability to hold at the same time, to hold in that truth. A lot of adult siblings sort of come back to what has happened in their childhood and recognized, whoa, that was a lot for me to carry. That was a lot for me to be scared for my brother or sister each time they left the house, because I knew that they could get themselves in trouble with their behaviours, or I knew that each medical appointment could be one where we had some really bad news. All of those different things that have happened in childhood, but because it has become normalised, it's not until they take the step into adulthood, or they have their own children, or they start thinking about having their own children, and they consider, hang on, is this something that I want to juggle again? A lot of the families that we deal with have adoptions, not so much a thing in Australia, but, a lot of the families we deal with are talking about conditions that have some sort of genetic component. So they're thinking about, okay, well, if I have a child, what about if they have that condition that my brother or sister had? Or what about if they don't, but then I have another child and the next one does, and that child becomes a sibling child, and the things that I had to deal with during my childhood, how do I support them through that in a way that perhaps my parents didn't have the knowledge and understanding and capacity to deal with at that point?
Yeah, so we're talking about this multi-generational piece, but then I'm thinking about, well, many times if your sibling has a disability or a chronic condition or complex developmental trauma that often lasts the dysmaturity and the dysregulation can last a lifetime, but often at least into the late 20s, early 30s, that there is the possibility that the siblings are either wondering or they know that they are going to be playing a role in long-term care. Mm-hmm. And how do families figure out connection versus burden versus choice? Mm-hmm. Like those feel like things I'm actually unfamiliar with. I do have a son with autism who's now a daughter, so I always have a hard time with the pronouns here. Just transitioned. My eldest daughter, I know she has said to me on many occasions, well, Mom, when you're not here, I'm going to take care of her. And she can hardly take care of herself. So I know it's very hard for her to be thinking about this. It weighs on her. I mean, I'm a long way from the grave, I hope. But, anything can happen, right? So this is a thought she has on a regular basis.
Yeah. And Look, sibling kids talk to us about this, that they recognise this from a very early age, that at some stage they may need to step into that caregiving role. And I said at the start that we aren't a carer organisation, but we recognise that siblings step in and out of carer roles across their lifespan. I think it's really important for parents to really clearly communicate with their sibling child about what their expectations are, but give them the grace and space to make their own decisions too. There are so many different options for what the future can look like, and making sure that everyone's on the same page. We have siblings who contact us and say, I know there is this expectation that I'm going to take that on, and I can't with my life. It's not a possibility. It's not a reality. I can't do that. I live in a different state, or my own family responsibilities prohibit it, or my work would change so drastically, or I just don't want to. And that's also fine. You know, sibling children don't have an obligation to take on that role. Parents need to have open communication with their sibling children about what their expectations are, and recognise that when if the sibling child says, not for me, that's okay. And work as a family to work out what the future does look like in those situations. You know, is it supported accommodation? Is it a family trust that you set up? Is it a micro board that sits around the person with additional needs? If they've got real complexity in their lives, do they need some sort of decision-making authority that sits outside of themselves? And, you know, depending where in the world you are, there are different forms that might take. But recognise that there might be an opt-in or there might be an opt-out, and it might look different at different times in your sibling child's life. I feel like I get a bit repetitive because I keep saying to parents, it's communication, it's communication, it's communication, but it is communication the whole way through. Mm-hmm. I read a memoir the other day of a sibling child who, she can't remember this, but her mum told her later in life that she was 4 when she first said, I can't have kids of my own because one day I will have to take on care of my brother.
No.
4. And her mum said to her at 4, no, that's not your responsibility. You're his sister. And I would like to have you involved in his life, but you don't need to plan your whole life around looking after him. The more communication that parents have with their sibling children about what those expectations are, the better that relationship can be. And, you know, if a child is feeling from day dot that I have no agency over the rest of my life because I happen to have been born into a family where there is someone with additional needs and I'm going to have to do this forever, there's a really good chance that when they get to their own decision-making time, they're going to go, yeah, no, not for me. If they are told, I totally respect what you want to do and I want you to have your own life and I want you to have a beautiful, wild, free life. I want you to have it all. If they are then involved in their brother or sister's lives in a way that adds value, adds depth to that experience, the value in that is just, to speak from my own experience for a moment, my stepdaughter will never live independently. She is nonverbal. She has very high support needs. She's in that prepubescent period of her life. She has very low receptive language skills. She will always need to be in some form of supported accommodation. She loves going out with my kids. She doesn't necessarily play with my kids, but she likes being alongside them and she likes watching them do things. In the future, when we're not here, and she's living in supported accommodation, which is most likely where she will end up. But if they are still involved in her in a way that they go and visit her and they take her on excursions and she has nieces and nephews that she can interact with, the depth and the richness of her life is so much more because that relationship will still be there. We see a lot of adult siblings who will talk about the fact that they have nothing to do with their family anymore, that they've made a decision in adulthood that there was too much on their plate too early, and they need to prioritise themselves. And so their brother or sister who is living in supported accommodation is being supported by people who are paid, not by people who love them, just by people who are paid. And so I think, you know, parents sometimes have that fear of, I don't want to say that they can go off and do their own thing without recognizing what that might actually look like. So having those honest conversations about what does support look like in the long term, allowing your sibling child to be honest and have that agency about what they want their life course to look like, respecting that and celebrating that can oftentimes have a much more positive, significant impact than imposing these expectations on your sibling child.
Yeah, I love the notion of conversations in a way that protects both connection and choice. Because when you have that freedom, it frees you to choose something less free.
Yeah.
And
exactly.
Out of love, right? Out of love and less out of burden and duty, which always creates something akin to resentment, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. And just coming back to that communication point, if your sibling child does want to take other responsibilities, okay, but talk to them about what that actually means, because we have a lot of older siblings who have gone into, I don't want to say panic mode, but something akin to that, because mum and dad have all of a sudden passed away, or something has happened with them where they've lost capacity to be able to do that. But mum and dad have also been, well, I don't want to burden you with this knowledge until you need it. Mm-hmm. And life doesn't always go to plan. You know, if you have plans in place, if there are those sorts of plans and mechanisms in place, there's a kindness in sharing that information too. So if you're talking to your adult sibling and they've said to you, look, at some stage, I'm happy to take on financial decision making for my brother who's unable to do that. Talk to them about where the bank accounts are. Don't say to them, I'll let you know when you need to know, because when they need to know, you might not necessarily be there to hand over the information. The number of times we hear from adult siblings who have had something catastrophic happened within their family and they are grieving in whatever way, whether they've lost their parent or their parent has had something significant happen to them, and they're trying to balance that grief that they're feeling for what's happened within their own relationship, parental relationship, with trying to navigate, oh my goodness, I don't know how to unpick where all of this decision making actually sits, or what's in place, or who the support workers are, or even who the company is that is providing that support for my brother or sister. So if you have made that decision that at some point the sibling child is going to come in and take some form of responsibility, have that conversation too about what it all looks like. And don't say to them, you have to take it over now, but share enough information that they've got it there, they've got it at hand, so that if something does happen, they have a bit more space to process what's going on and be in a position to help.
That's great advice. I've been thinking about that myself, just anyway. But
conversation we had in our kitchen on the weekend.
Yeah, we really need to be having these conversations probably more than any of us really do. I have 3 older sisters, and my mom passed away when I was a teenager. Like, nobody checked on me. Nobody asked me how I was or where I was or what I was doing. And as I aged, I really got angry about my siblings not taking care of me. When I got into my 20s, I was sort of a really righteously angry person. And I went to each of them. I'm like, why didn't you take care of me? You were so much older than me. And, they all of them said they were grieving, the loss of our mom, and that they didn't realize at the time that I wasn't grown up because I was 16, and that I needed that kind of check-in. And I'm like, well, why wouldn't I? I'm a kid still. And their answer was, we just didn't realize that was our job. And, why would it be their job? But I did think it was their job as one of their siblings. So it's an interesting conversation, right?
It is. And I think there's nothing like the righteous anger of our 20s to sort of fuel some of those conversations. Yeah. But people are dealing with so much overwhelming, sometimes conflicting emotions when these things happen within families, that you add in an additional layer of somebody whose needs are, their daily life needs so much support, that when you are in that depth of grief, how do you start to unpick, okay, well, I'm feeling like this, I don't want to get out of bed today, but I also am not sure that my sister, who's living in supported accommodation and doesn't have the ability to tell her support workers how she's feeling and has bills that need paying and needs someone to continue to advocate for her. And, it's sort of layer upon layer upon layer when these things happen. So I understand talking about our own demise is not a lot of fun,
No,
but we're all going
necessary.
to end up there. So let's have the conversation. Let's try and smooth the path for all of our children when that happens, by being upfront with them about everything that is going to happen. And here's the information that you need to make that journey a bit easier, a bit smoother when I can't actually be here to give you that hug that I want to.
Right. Well, we're coming to the end of our podcast today, and I'm wondering if you could shift something in how other people, other communities, or governments support siblings, or what would that be?
I think the seen and supported is the number one thing for siblings. I think that it's seen and supported within their own families, but it's also seen and supported and recognised for the fact that these kids are often carrying a lot heavier load than their peers, and they may appear to be coping really well. And a lot of the time, that is the internalized, I need to be easy. But, if you're a teacher and you know that there is a family that's got some additional bits and pieces going on, check in with the sibling child. And when they tell you, I'm fine, recognise that that is not necessarily I'm fine. Recognise that, when you send home homework for kids that requires parental input, that yes, they may have parental figures in their house, but those parental figures may be so overwhelmed with what they're dealing with supporting their other child that they don't necessarily have that capacity. I would say for the other adult people, don't tell these children to be easy, to not make waves. Allow them to feel life in its messiness and support them in that. Recognise that resilience doesn't magically arise from nowhere, that we need to work on that with our kids, and we need to let them know that we don't expect you to be okay when things are rough, and we will support you to recognise what that is. From a government perspective, I can only sort of speak from the Australian context. I don't know enough about your situation in the US with this, but we often talk at a government level around family support and how families need to be supported. And what that is actually code for is parents need to be supported. We need to recognise that family support needs to encompass all members of families, that parents, as the adults in the room, theoretically, we have got the skills, we've got the tools, we have got the knowledge of how to navigate these situations. The little people who are in the lives of these families don't necessarily. And so family support needs to encompass all members of families. So that would be my takeaway. Make sure they are seen, make sure they are supported, and recognise that those I'm fines are often just a stock standard response because they don't want to create waves.
Yeah, that's a great reminder. And I think we know these things as parents of children from difficult beginnings, but maybe we need to shine a light like today we're doing on the siblings just a little bit more, because I know they have vicarious trauma, and I know they have PTSD that they carry on into adulthood sometimes. So thank you so much for highlighting that here. I would love for you to say anything you want to about your organization, and of course, all the information will be in the show notes. Is there anything you'd like to share?
Yeah, look, feel free to have a look at our website. A lot of the resources and references that we talk about obviously are Australian-centric, but there may be some supports there that can help people. We've also got references to things like fictionalised accounts, books, articles that may be relevant to your family. So have a look at our website, siblingsaustralia.org.au. And please, if there is any questions that people have, more than happy to answer questions, more than happy to direct you to any resources that we know that exist locally within where your listeners are listening to this from. If there are those resources available within their local communities, and more than happy to help out siblings, families, professionals in how we support siblings across the life course.
Thank you so much, Shannon, for this really important conversation. I'm so glad I'm having it. I have actually never had it with anybody. I mean, parents, but not with any professional. So I'm delighted. Thank you.
Thank you so much for having me. I've really enjoyed it.
You're welcome. And my lovely listeners, thank you so much for joining us here today on Unmuted Love, where nothing is off limits to talk about when you're parenting children from difficult beginnings. And remember, your love matters when more than love is required. See you in the next episode.